Hey YouTube, I'm back. This is Nina. Hello everyone. Now what I came back to do this time is to read again. So we're starting off where we left off earlier, which was the growth and transformation. And bear with me because I'm doing all this from my phone. I am new to this social media. So I don't know how to work everything yet, but I am figuring it all out. So just bear with me. And thank you for viewing the pages. Like I said, I'm no teacher, but I can read. So I'm just trying to help out. Okay, so this is the growth and transformation. Page 39 of 68. The United States came of age in decades following the Civil War. And if you hear a ringing, I am working, so bear with me. I'm just going to pause and then I'll pick up after the call where I left off. But anyway, the United States came of age in the decades following the Civil War. The frontier gradually vanished. A rural republic became an urban nation. I'm trying to get your view. Get it a little more steady. I don't know how to stop the lights from going across the screen, so I'm sorry. Anyway, the republic became an urban nation. Great factories, steel mills, and transcontinental railroads were built. Cities grew quickly, and millions of people arrived from the other countries to begin new lives in a land of opportunity. Inventors harnessed the power of science. Alexander Graham Bell developed the telephone. Thomas Edison produced the light bulb, and with George Eastman, the moving picture. Before 1860, the government issued 36,000 patents. In the next 30 years, it issued 440,000. And I think this is somewhat of what the drop is always pointing out, like the hijack, because 36,000 to 440,000. I mean, who were they stealing these ideas from? Right? I mean, if they tore down their own place that they had and came here, and all of a sudden they're just, inventing things, like, I don't know, that may be the hijack. But anyway, it was an era of corporate consolidation, especially in the steel, rail, oil, and telecommunications industries. Monopolies denied competition in the marketplace, which led to calls for government regulation. A law was passed in 1890 to prevent monopolies from restraining trade, but it was not vigorously enforced at first. Even with great gains in industry, farming remained America's basic occupation. Yet it too witnessed enormous changes. Farmland doubled and scientists developed improved seeds. Right. Machines, including mechanical planters, reapers, and threshers, took over much of the work that had previously been done by hand. American farmers produced enough grain, cotton, beef, pork, and wool to supply the growing domestic market and still have large surpluses to export. The western region of the United States continued to attract settlers. Miners staked claims in the ore-rich mountains. Cattle ranchers on the vast grasslands, sheep farmers in the river valleys, and farmers on the Great Plains. I'm going to pause there so that you can see this picture. And this is Sitting Bull. And I think that's Sioux chief who led the last great battle of the Plains Indians against the U.S. Army, defeating General George Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. And of course, this is Thomas Edison. He examines film used in a motion picture projector that he invented with George Eastman. And I'm by no means saying that they can't be inventors. All I'm saying is, I just, from 36,000 to 440,000, that's a big number. Anyway, cowboys on horses took care of the animals and guided them to distant railroads for shipment east. This is the image of America that many people still have, even though the era of the Wild West cowboy lasted only about 30 years. From the time that the Europeans landed on the east coast of America, their migration westward meant confrontation with native peoples. For many years, government policy had been to move Native Americans beyond the reach of the white frontier to the lands reserved for their use. Time and again, however, the government ignored its agreements and opened these areas to white settlement. In the late 1800s, Sioux tribes in the northern plains and Apaches in the southwest fought back hard. I learned how to scroll without using my mouse. Hold on. Okay. Well, I knew how to scroll, but it always just goes haywire. But I'm catching the hang of it, okay? Okay, so time and time again, however, the government ignored its agreements and opened these areas to white settlement. In the late 1800s, Sioux tribes in the northern plains and Apaches in the southwest fought back hard to, again, I'm going to skip the pictures and then finish this sentence and then we'll go back. Interesting. To preserve their way of life. Of course. Preserve their way of life. Life that, you know, they were living off the necks of other people. Why not preserve that? So here on this picture are the immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in New York City, and that's the principal gateway to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. From 1890 to 1920, almost 19 million people entered the United States as immigrants. So they just poured in, huh? Okay. Moving on. Now this is Mulberry Street in New York City, also known as Little Italy. In the early years of the 20th century, newly arrived immigrant families often settled in densely populated urban enclaves. Looks overcrowded. I guess that's what densely populated urban enclaves are. Reminds me of that sign that we saw. I don't know if I was with you all or not, but I saw a sign that says, maybe it was on Instagram, you have the duty to move into your own neighborhoods because you could potentially turn this neighborhood into a ghetto. And it's just like, really? Y'all had signs for that? But yeah, that's a better view of that picture. Way better. Okay, y'all see those people? They just pouring in. Okay, so we're moving forward to the next picture. Now, I mean, and to think, I've never been to New York City, but I heard it's crowded. And this picture is a good descriptive of what people describe when you go there. Okay, so that's the last picture. You're going back to reading. Okay, so they were skilled fighters, but were eventually overwhelmed by government forces. Official policy after these conflicts was well-intentioned, but sometimes proved disastrous. In 1934, Congress passed a measure that attempted to protect tribal customs and communal life on the reservations. The last decades of the 19th century saw a race by European powers to colonize Africa and compete for trade in Asia. Many Americans believed the United States had a right and a duty to expand its influence into other parts of the world. Many others, however, rejected any actions that hinted at imperialism. A brief war with Spain in 1898 left the United States with control over several Spanish overseas possessions: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Officially, the United States encouraged them to move toward self-government, but in fact it maintained administrative control. Idealism in foreign policy existed alongside the practical desire to protect the economic interests of a once isolated nation that had become a world power. Okay, so we're moving on to discontent and reform. Now, by 1900, America's political foundations had endured growing pains: civil war, prosperity, and economic depression. The ideal of religious freedom had been sustained. Free public education had largely been realized, and a free press had been maintained. At the same time, however, political power seemed concentrated in the hands of corrupt officials and their friends in business. Y'all, I'm gonna try to fix the blinking. I don't know what to do. Hold on. Automatic focus. So is that what is it trying to focus? Let's pause it and see. Hold on. I tried. Anyway, political power seems concentrated in the hands of corrupt officials and their friends in business. In response, a reform movement called progressivism, arose. Its goals included greater democracy and social justice, honest government, and more effective regulation of business. Writers and social critics protested practices that were unfair, unhealthy, and dangerous. Upton Sinclair, Ida M. Tarbell, Theodore Dreiser, Lincoln Steffens, and others produced a literature of exposure that put pressure on lawmakers to correct these abuses through legislation. The reformers believed that expanding the scope of government would ensure the progress of U.S. society and welfare of its citizens. And when they say citizens, they mean immigrants. President Theodore Roosevelt embodied the spirit of progressivism, and believed that reforms needed to be addressed nationally. He worked with Congress to regulate monopolies and take legal action against companies that violated the law. He also was tireless in his efforts to conserve the United States' natural resources, manage public lands, and protect areas for recreational use. Right. Reforms continued during the presidencies of William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. The Federal Reserve banking system was established to set interest rates and control the money supply. And this is the 1%, you guys. The Federal Trade Commission was established to deal with unfair methods of competition by businesses. New laws were enacted to help improve working conditions for sailors and railroad laborers. We know who that was. A county extension system was developed to help farmers get information and credit, and taxes on imported goods were lowered or eliminated to help reduce the cost of living for all Americans. The Progressive Era was also the era when great numbers of people from all over the world came to the United States. Almost 19 million people arrived between 1890 and 1921. Earlier immigrants had been chiefly Northern and Western Europeans and some Chinese. The new arrival came from Italy, Russia, Poland, Greece, the Balkans, Canada, Mexico, and Japan. The United States has always been a melting pot of nationalities, and for 300 years, few restrictions were placed. Oh, see, that's what I mean. Hold on. Few restrictions were placed on immigration starting in the 1920s. However, quotas were established in response to the Americans' fears that their jobs and culture were being threatened by the newcomers. And they were the newcomers. These people are hypocrites. Now, while large surges of immigration have historically created social strains, most Americans whose own ancestors arrived as immigrants believe that the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor represents the spirit of a welcoming land to those yearning to breathe free. This belief has preserved the United States as a nation of nations. We are a nation of nations. Okay, so this is the picture. I'm going to get a little closer. Now, these are children working at the Indiana Glass Works in 1908. Enacting child labor laws was one of the principal goals of the progressive movement in this era. Let me see. Let's look at the faces. And let us find the truth and drop. And Lex always say, I don't know how official this picture is, but maybe it's official. I don't know. Maybe we'll find something else later that'll let us know. Now, World War I and the 1920s, prosperity and the Great Depression. Now, war in Europe in 1914 with Germany and Hungary. Okay, so war in Europe in 1914 with Germany and Austria-Hungary fighting Britain, France, Italy, and Russia affected U.S. interests almost from the start. The British and the German navies both interfered with American shipping, but German submarine attacks were deadly. Almost 130 Americans died when a submarine sank the British ocean liner Lusitania in 1915, and President Woodrow Wilson demanded an end to the attacks and they stopped for a while, but by 1917 they had resumed. The United States declared war. The efforts of more than 1,750,000 U.S. troops played a decisive role in the defeat of German and Austro-Hungarian alliance. An armistice, technically a truce, but actually a surrender, was concluded on November the 11th, 1918. My grandmother was born in 19... One moment, I got a call. Okay, sorry. Okay, so where were we? Yeah. Okay, I read that 1918. I'm sorry, y'all. I work from home and I have to answer calls. Or I might not have my bill money. Anyway, President Wilson negotiated an end to the conflict based on his 14-point plan for achieving lasting peace. It included an end to secret international agreements, free trade between nations, a reduction in national armaments, self-rule for subjugated European nationalities, and formation of an association, a League of Nations, to help guarantee political independence and territorial integrity for large and small countries alike. Now, that was the hijack. I saw a video, and it was from the Hopi Indians, I think, and the guy was saying that the League of Nations had a meeting and they tried to go and they wouldn't let them in. The indigenous people weren't allowed in. So we know that's part of the hijack. Anyway, the final peace treaty, however, contained virtually none of these points, as the victors insisted on harsh punishment. Wilson's idea of a League of Nations remained in the Treaty of Versailles, but even he was unable to gain enough support for the concept, and the United States rejected it. America reverted to its instinctive isolationism. And by isolated, they mean taken over. And I just think they want it to be alone so that they can slaughter the indigenous. But that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. So this is the picture of the American infantry forces in 1918 firing a 37 millimeter gun advanced against German positions in World War I. Okay. And this is a picture, flappers posing for the camera at 1920s era party. So they're just over here dancing and just laughing it up, having a good old time, okay? Okay. The immediate post-war period was one of labor unrest and racial tensions. Farmers were struggling because of the abrupt end of wartime demand. One moment, I have a call. Okay. Maybe it don't need to be so bright. Is that it? And sorry guys, I get a call, it kind of throws me off. Anyway, the immediate post-war period was one of labor unrest and racial tensions. Farmers were struggling because the abrupt end of wartime demand. Bolshevik violence fueled a Red Scare that led to decades of militant hostility towards the revolutionary communist movement. Despite these problems, for a few years in the 1920s, the United States enjoyed a period of real and broadly distributed prosperity. Families purchased their first automobile, radio, and refrigerator, and they began going to the movies regularly. And the suffragists, after decades of political activism, succeeded in getting approval of a constitutional amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote. The good times did not last. The value of many stocks, which had become artificially inflated, sounds like now, fell dramatically in October of 1929. Over the next 3 years, the business recession in America became a part of worldwide economic depression. Businesses and factories shut down, banks failed, farm income dropped, and by November of 1932, 20% of Americans were unemployed. The presidential campaign that year was chiefly a debate over the causes of the Great Depression and ways to reverse. Now I want to scroll up to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. Yeah, that was them dancing and carrying on. Ways to reverse it. Incumbent Herbert Hoover had started the process of rebuilding the economy, but his efforts had little impact and he lost the election to Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt was infectiously optimistic and was ready to use federal authority to achieve bold remedies. Under his leadership, the United States would enter another era of economic and political change. And we're going on into the New Deal and World War II. In the early 1930s, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed a New Deal, a plan designed to lift Americans out of the Great Depression as quickly as possible. He noted that democracy had disappeared in other countries at that time, not because the people opposed democracy, but because they had grown tired of unemployment and insecurity. Under his leadership, a federal corporation was established to ensure deposits in savings banks. Regulations were imposed on the sale of stocks. Laws were passed to guarantee the right of workers to be represented by the unions. Farmers received subsidies for certain crops and assistance in preventing soil erosion. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men to plant trees, clean up waterways, and improve facilities in national parks. So this is after they came in and trashed everything. So this is a picture. I don't know why. Let me clean my camera. Hold on. Seems like it did something. This is a picture. The Depression era soup line in the 1930s on the left. And on the right is President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He signs perhaps the most far-reaching legislation of the New Deal. One moment. Okay. I know y'all don't see the holding, but thank you. Now, these are the two pictures. Yeah, that's the soup line, and that's Roosevelt signing perhaps the most far-reaching legislation of the New Deal, the Social Security Act of 1935. Today, Social Security, one of the largest government programs in the United States, provides retirement and disability income to millions of Americans. And this is a was. They are draining Social Security. And hard workers like yourself and myself, I've been working since I was 14, just may not get Social Security. Now, where we left off, I'm going to go back and find the sentence because I went all left. Now, the Civilian Conservation Corps employed young men to plant trees, clean up waterways, and improve facilities in national parks. The Public Works Administration hired skilled laborers for large-scale projects such as building dams and bridges, and the Tennessee Valley Authority provided flood control and electric power for that impoverished area. And the Federal Emergency Relief Administration distributed aid, often in the form of direct payments. Now, a second round of programs employed workers to build roads, airports, and schools, and hired artists, actors, musicians, and writers, and gave part-time employment to young people. It also established the Social Security system to help the poor, disabled, and elderly. Americans were generally uneasy with the idea of big government, yet they wanted the government to take greater responsibility for the welfare of ordinary people. And while the New Deal provided tangible help for millions of Americans, it never succeeded in restoring prosperity. Better times would come, but not until after another world war had swept the United States into its path. The United States tried to remain neutral while totalitarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan expanded their control over neighboring countries. Debate intensified after Germany invaded France and began bombing Britain. Despite strong isolationist sentiment, Congress voted to conscript soldiers and strengthen the military. And that is a picture of World War II in the Pacific was characterized by large-scale naval and air battles. A Japanese plane plunges down into flames during an attack on U.S. carrier fleet in the Mariana Islands, June 1944. I'm going to see if I can get you a better view. Guess that's the plane. Okay. And this is General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander in Europe, talks with paratroopers shortly before the Normandy invasion, June 6th of 1944. And this is him talking to the troops. And this is the assembly line of P-38 Lightning fighter planes during World War II. With its massive output of war material, the United States became, in the words of President Roosevelt, the arsenal of democracy. Right. Doesn't that sound so catchy? The arsenal of democracy. So this is when they started taking democracy everywhere else, right? Okay. Now, most people were focused on what was happening in Europe when Japan threatened to seize sources of raw materials used by Western industries. In response, the United States imposed an embargo on the one commodity Japan needed above all others, oil, and demanded that it withdrew from territories it had conquered. Japan refused, and on December 7, 1941, it carried out a devastating attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy, by then allies of Japan,